In the last mini lecture, I talked about the theory of forms, and in this mini lecture, I want to give you an overview of how that theory sort of has fared in the history of philosophy, right? What alternatives were given to it, and just hopefully help you kind of put it into context a little better. Now, I must say in this video, you're going to see a little bit more of my biases and my own views come out than normal, because I'm trying to give you a pretty brief summary of how these views about forms, or about what Plato's trying to talk about with the theory of forms, how that gets developed or misunderstood, or alternatives to it are developed throughout the history of philosophy. And of course, I'm a big fan of Plato, so take what I say, I guess, with a grain of salt, right? Definitely everything in this video is an oversimplification. The history of philosophy is really complicated, and to present a short video just to give you an overview is definitely going to be an oversimplification. But you got to start somewhere, so I figure this oversimplification is going to be helpful. It will help you get a sense of things, and then obviously, read more about these things and deepen your views, right? This is just an overview in this video. Plato's theory of forms addresses these perennial philosophical problems. There's two of them. The first one is what I'll call the problem of the one and the many. The second one is what I'll call the problem of universals. So let me talk about each of these briefly. So the problem of the one and the many is that everything we experience in our world around us is both one and many. So each thing we experience tends to be one whole that has many parts, right? My body is one whole, has many parts. Your body, the tables, chairs, rooms, houses, everything is a whole that has parts, at least the objects of our general experience. And that things are also one thing with many properties too, right? So we can focus on parts. That's one way to look at the way in which things are one and many. But things are also one and many in the sense that they have many properties even though they're one thing, right? So I'm human, I'm this one thing, or whatever you want to say, like I'm Michael, but I have many different properties. I'm 5'10", I'm white, I'm male, right? Like you can name all these properties about me, even though I'm just one person. Somehow I'm one person, even though I've got a bunch of different properties. Now, here's where the problem comes in. Many means not one, right? If something is many, we're saying it's not one. Which means what we're saying is everything we experience is both one and not one. But that's a contradiction, or at least that seems to be a contradiction, right? That's where the problem is there. This seems to be a contradiction because it seems like I'm saying our experience is self-contradictory. Everything is both one thing, but then it's not one thing too. And so that apparent contradiction there requires an explanation, right? If we can explain how that's possible, then the contradiction would go away. Right? We can say, well, maybe it's because they're one in this sense, but they're not one in this other sense. And so that's the problem of the one and the many, how to explain how things can both be one and not one. Problem of universals. Problem of universals, sometimes people call this the problem of the one and the many too, although I think the problem of the one and the many is broader than this. But the problem of universals is that everything we experience is various kinds of things, so it arises from this fact. Everything we experience is various kinds of things. What I mean by that, I'm a human, right? You're experiencing me, so I'm a human. I'm also a professor, right? Those are human, professor, those are the kind of things that I am. And there's, of course, a bunch of other kinds of things that I am, right? I'm a brother to my siblings, and father to my children, and so on and so forth. And then beyond just, right, like me or you, horses, birds, cows, they're a kind of thing, animals, right? And many individual beings are human, or have human nature, right? So all of us are a kind of thing, humans. And so that's the problem of universals. How can many different beings have the same nature, right? If you and me are really different beings, we're not the same. How can we be the same thing, humans, right? How can we have that same human nature? Or to put this question or problem in a different way, what really justifies us in claiming that a bunch of different individual beings, like you and me and everyone else that we call humans, what justifies us in claiming that we're beings of the same kind, right? Why am I justified in claiming that we're all humans, to give an example? But this applies generally, right? Why am I justified in saying that this is a pen and this is a pen, right? Like we got two pens here, right? They're two totally different things. So why am I justified to say, well, they're both pens? That's the problem of universals, is sort of trying to explain why it's okay to name two totally separate individual things to say that really they share the same nature or they're one and the same kind of thing. The theory of forms addresses both these problems. The forms are what explain why something is one ultimately, right? It's one because it has the same form, and it's many because the many parts made out of participate in it. And then universals is also explained by forms, right? Why are we justified in calling all of us humans? Because we all share in the form humans. So theory of forms is a way of trying to solve both these problems, the problems of the one and the many, and the problem of universals. But these problems, of course, other philosophers have different ways of tackling them, different from Plato's theory of forms. And so that's what I want to give you in this lecture, is a brief overview of some different ways that well-known philosophers in the history of philosophy address these two problems. So let's start with Aristotle, the major Greek philosopher who is a student of Plato's and comes right after Plato. Aristotle didn't really like the way that Plato treated the forms as entities that don't exist anywhere, right? Entities that aren't anywhere. Like we just saw Diotima saying, forms aren't anywhere, they're not on earth, they're not an animal, they're not in heaven. And so Aristotle thinks that sounds like too weird, right? Like, what do you mean it's not anywhere? How can we even talk about something that's not anywhere? And this is, of course, one interpretation of like where Aristotle's problem is, and scholars disagree on like why exactly he's having a problem with this. I tend to think this is one of the major issues for Aristotle. And I think maybe the even deeper issue for Aristotle is that he wants his views to sound closer to common sense. He doesn't want us to be saying things that sound paradoxical, if we can avoid it. I mean, obviously, you're doing philosophy, anything's going to sound paradoxical, but he wants to make things closer to our normal way of thinking about the world, our normal way of talking about the world. And so what he essentially does, again, this is my interpretation, someone who likes Plato a lot and kind of prefers Plato to Aristotle's way of doing things, what I think Aristotle basically does is he takes Plato's views, adds some things to them, and really makes them closer to common sense. So I think Aristotle is like Plato, but made so it's a little closer to common sense, so that things sound less paradoxical, less radical. And Aristotle also offers a theory that's more of a system and more of an organized body of knowledge. So with Plato, we get a bunch of these dialogues, you get different themes in the dialogues, and if you read through them all, you can start to work out, well, here's kind of Plato's view, or what we would think it is, at least. But with Aristotle, he's much more straightforward. He'll just tell you what he thinks. And so he offers more of a system. The way that his thinking works is more systematic too. He has more technical terms. But that's basically what I take Aristotle to be doing. He's taking a lot of Platonic ideas, but tries to make more of a system out of it, and tries to make it a system that's more down to earth, more in the way we're normally thinking and talking about things. Not a system that is trying to sort of break you out of our normal way of thinking about things, which is, I take it Plato, a lot of what he's trying to do is break you out of our normal ways of thinking and talking about things. And so that's why Plato's much more comfortable with making claims that sound paradoxical at first, at least until you really think through them. So Aristotle, he basically agrees with Plato on most issues. Even if he'll say he doesn't agree, and he'll try to say, well, Plato's really doing this, and I'm doing something different. I think in a lot of cases, though, he's not super fair to Plato, or maybe he misunderstands Plato. I mean, who knows what's going on. But I see a lot of commonality between Plato and Aristotle. So Aristotle, for example, still posited forms. He still uses this terminology of eidos and form. But where he thinks he's going to be differing from Plato is that he doesn't want to say forms are separate from individual things. So instead of saying, well, the form isn't anywhere, it's sort of itself by itself, and in that sense, separate from individual things, Aristotle wants to make clear, no, forms are not separate from individual things. Instead, forms are in things as the nature, qualities, or quantities of things. So what Plato would call a form, Aristotle is going to say those are actually properties or qualities or natures of things. And so Aristotle says forms are in things as the thing's nature, as its qualities, or as its quantities. Forms are in our minds as universals. And so he's the one who comes up with this term. And by which he means they're concepts in our minds that correspond to the natures, qualities, and quantities in things. And our minds are able to abstract these natures from things as universals. So it's kind of what Plato would call a form, is for Aristotle it's going to be a nature or quality or quantity if we're talking about it in a thing, and it's going to be a concept or a universal if we're going to be talking about it in the mind. And so the problem of universals gets its name from this Aristotelian terminology and his notion of universals. So what happens as we go on in the history of philosophy? And again, still a reminder, this is all oversimplification, but mainstream medieval philosophy in the Islamic, Jewish, and Christian traditions generally follows Plato, Aristotle, or more frequently even some combination of the two. So they're taking kind of views from both sides. Some thinkers lean more in the Aristotelian direction, some thinkers lean more in the Plato direction. In the late medieval period, nominalism becomes popular, though. So I think I mentioned nominalism before, but just to review what it is, according to nominalism, there are no forms or common natures, either in things or separate from things, right? So there's no Platonic forms that are doing that work. There's not even common natures in things, like Aristotle would have said. Instead, there are only shared names and concepts that humans create, right? So our minds, or just we, create shared names or shared concepts we use. So for example, there's no real human nature that we all share somehow. There's no human nature we all have in common. Instead, human is a concept that we created and that we apply to one another. But it's not like we're all really sharing some common shared nature, humanity, right? Nominalism denies that. So nominalism is kind of people create these concepts and shared ideas. It's not like reality has shared properties or shared characteristics. All that we have in reality is discrete individual things, each of which is a completely different individual thing from another thing. Moving on, in early modern philosophy, the empiricists continue this nominalist idea, so they're working in a different framework than the late medievals were doing, but they take this nominalism idea and build their whole system with that included. So the philosophers I have in mind here, the famous ones are Hobbes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume. Right? These empiricists are all nominalists. The other major kind of grouping of philosophers in early modern philosophy, the rationalists, people like Descartes or Leibniz, they're more willing to grant that there are shared natures and that we don't just create all these concepts, so they're not nominalists. Instead, they talk about innate ideas, which are ideas that God puts into our minds when he created us. So for them, it's not like we created the idea of human being. It's rather God put that idea into the human mind when he created us. Or maybe if not, sometimes they're not always consistent whether that idea of human being is really put into our mind. But at least more fundamental kind of ideas like one or same or different, those are not just concepts that we create. Those are concepts that are fundamental, God puts them in our mind, and they're true. So these rationalists were closer to the Plato and Aristotle side of things, where the empiricists are the nominalist side. The modern philosopher Immanuel Kant then brings us back out of this fantasy land, right, which is what I think of nominalism and innate ideas, again, putting my views out there, right? I think nominalism is a ridiculous theory. I mean, I didn't really explain why in this video, and we won't have time to do that exactly. But yeah, I think nominalism is a ridiculous theory. The innate ideas is a little better, but it's also pretty, I don't take it like super seriously either. And so Kant, luckily, gets us back out of those theories, at least. And what he does is he argues that fundamental universals, so again, I don't know what Kant would think about human nature necessarily, but at least when we're talking about fundamental concepts like same and different, one and many, whole and part, those kind of basic ideas, he thinks we don't just create those. Rather, those are structures of consciousness itself. So those are like the structures of our minds or of conscious experience. And then the mind uses those structures, those basic ideas, as building blocks for the world in order to construct the world as we actually experience it. So in a way, he's combining kind of this idea that we create what Plato would call the forms, but he doesn't want to say we create it in the sense that it's just concepts we're coming up with. He thinks it's not exactly we created, it's more like it's what we are, right? Consciousness itself, the shared, what we all have in common with our conscious experience includes these categories and concepts within itself, and then we subconsciously build the whole world that we experience using those categories. So that's Kant. He's a kind of major modern philosopher. Now moving even more towards contemporary philosophy, much of 19th and 20th century continental European philosophies, this is philosophy especially in France and Germany, combines Kantian insights with Platonic and Aristotelian views, either from Plato, Aristotle themselves, or from medieval Platonic and Aristotelian thinkers. And some people in this tradition are more explicit about doing that. Some just kind of do it automatically. Major thinkers here in German idealism would be Hegel. And Hegel is definitely taking some Platonic and Aristotelian concepts and kind of using them to modify and fundamentally remake this basic Kantian point of view. In phenomenology, which is more 20th century continental philosophy, you have people like Husserl and Heidegger, who again take Platonic or Aristotelian ideas and will bring those together into a Kantian, basically unite them with a Kantian framework so that we get, what really is like a whole new approach to doing philosophy, but this taking ideas from Plato, Aristotle, Kant, and a lot of traditions within the history of philosophy. Now, you might go, well, what about today? Today, people are really all over the place. So some people are just straight up Platonists, like me, and a number of my friends and colleagues. Some people, there's a lot of Aristotelians today. There's probably way more Aristotelians than there are Platonists, to be honest. There are plenty of Kantians and Hegelians still, and there are definitely plenty of nominalists. There was a survey done a few years ago where it asked philosophers a bunch of questions, and it looks like they got about 931 responses to this question about abstract objects, which would be like what Plato would call forms. And they asked the philosophers, so these are philosophers alive today, do you lean more in the Platonism direction or the nominalism direction? Because Platonism and nominalism are two ends of the spectrum, really, and people like Aristotle or Kant would be between the two. And so here you can see the responses that people gave. So accept or lean towards Platonism, 39.3 of the philosophers today doing that survey, they said they're either accept Platonism or they lean in that direction. So basically they're Platonists, Aristotelians, Kantians, Hegelians, or something else, that is along those same lines. Then 37.7% accepted or leaned towards nominalism. And then there were, and 23% that marked themselves as other, like, you couldn't categorize them in this way. So I will say that this Platonist view is still, or I don't know if it's right to call it the Platonist view, but views that lean towards Platonism and Platonism are kind of the, just barely beat out nominalism there, with almost 40% of philosophers today are either on the Platonism side or leaning towards Platonism. And so you can see today these views on this issue of problem of universals, the one and the many, or what's called here abstract objects, they differ pretty significantly, and there's different camps out there. And all of that's from this survey on philpapers.org. If you want to take a look at the website down there, they surveyed philosophers on a lot of different questions. So if you're sort of into philosophy, that's kind of a cool, fun thing to look at. The website's right down there on the screen, philpapers.org/surveys/results.pl.